Hello, this is Aaron Wren. Welcome back to the podcast. My guest today is David Bahnsen. He is the founder, managing partner, and chief investment officer of the Bahnsen Group, which is a wealth management firm with $7.1 billion under management. I don't know about you, that sounds like a lot of money to me. He's been listed in many lists of the most influential and best wealth managers in America, including from the Financial Times, which might be my favorite paper. And he is the author of a relatively new book called Full Time Work in the Meaning of Life. That's what he joins me to discuss today. And there's a link to buy that in the show notes. David, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Aaron. It's a pleasure to be with you.
You are a critic of the evangelical faith and work movement. Why is that?
I think that I would have been a critic for many, many years, decades, throughout the 20th century of the lack of a faith and work movement. And then since the sort of inception of one, I would be a critic, not so much of the fact that it exists, but what is missing from it. I think that the faith and work movement is largely centered around providing resources to people who are, in some form of white collar profession, have achieved some degree of upwardly mobile success, and they're looking to give them resources, breakfast Bible study with other believers, some form of community fellowship, all good things. That's not what I'm critical of. I'm critical that the faith and work movement still largely sees work as transactional, that it sees work as a means to an end of the important kingdom work, that our work helps facilitate better things with evangelism or missions or church or whatnot, as opposed to really leaning in to a fully kingdom-oriented view of our work itself being intrinsically important, the inherent value of work. I believe that the faith and work movement is not fully latched on to that idea.
Yeah, your book makes the claim that work is the meaning of life. And one of the things you say at the beginning is some of what you say might be controversial. Maybe that would be one. Why do you say work is the meaning of life?
Well, I do think that it's less controversial when people understand and read what it is I'm actually saying. But the reason I say it is because God said it. And so I don't think I'm saying anything that ought to be controversial, but it is somewhat provocative when it's taken to its full implication. Although I would argue that doing so leads to a very joyful and meaningful and purposeful outcome. I say it's the meaning of life because God created us and gave us an account of that creation in Genesis chapter 1. And what he essentially did is spend the first 25 verses telling us the story of him creating the world, and then took a little pause in verse 26 before giving us the account of making us, and set the stage for what it was he was doing. And four times in two verses said that he made us in his image and likeness, that we alone were made as image bearers of God, made with this elevated dignity. That elevated status is reinforced in verse 31 when he referred to us as being very good, after only giving the mere description of good to, little things like the oceans, the sun, moon, and stars, and all that kind of stuff. So the animal and plant kingdom are separated from what he made with mankind. But these verses 26 through 28 in the middle of this creation account tell us that he made us to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, to rule over the earth. We have commonly referred to this as a creation mandate, a dominion mandate. But what I am trying to say is that there is no way to interpret any of these verses, us living out our image-bearing status with God, being fruitful, being multiplicative, all of these concepts, including into Genesis 2, caring for the garden, ruling over it, this entire setup of why God made us is able to be summarized in the synonym work: stewardship, care, dominion, And I think that this concept is vitally important in economics. It's one of the passions of my life that Christians understand. Economics is a social science, a moral philosophy of addition and multiplication, not subtraction and division. And that in that process, what we're essentially doing is what we would refer to as work. And I recognize in chapter 3, we get into sin and the curses. And there is, of course, a redemptive change in history. But the creational normative has been established that God made us to work as he himself worked.
One of the things you clearly distinguish is between the production view of life from the consumption view of life. I'll just read a line from your book. You say, I am convinced that the fundamental divide between the two primary economic camps today is not big government versus small government. This can lead to the classic debate of central planning versus laissez faire. But at its root, this is a debate over the primacy of production versus consumption.
If it's funny, I actually think I'm being very generous here because when one understands the sort of grandfather of central planning and 20th century modern economics, I don't think John Maynard Keynes would disagree with anything I said, that the focus on stimulation of aggregate demand, of consumption as a driver of economic activity, it lends itself to central planning, that there are masterful manipulators that could help convince us to consume more when we don't feel like consuming. My anthropological view is that God made us with a certain reason and rationality, certain moral responsibilities, and various faculties, both as individuals and as members of communities, the way we interact with others. And that I don't think most human beings need to be incentivized to consume. I think we know what our appetites are, what we like and don't like. And if there's anything that's a default position for the human person, it's to consume. But that what we were made to do is produce. And this is most evidenced in the fact that we cannot consume if we don't produce. And in fact, we can't consume if someone else doesn't produce. That our consumption is afforded by our production, and our consumption is enhanced by the productive capacity of others. So getting this right from the garden, where we see God being a creator and making us to be a co-creator, and the fact that God did not make the world finished, that he made the world with raw materials, but made us to be the co-creators who would go extract the potential from creation. I think this is an incredibly important theological concept, but it's fundamentally economic. If you want more economic growth, you need more production, and consumption follows. And of course, production responds to signals that are learned from consumption. And this is a pro-cyclical, positive feedback loop understanding of economics. The consumption first theory fails economically. It begs for central planning, but it essentially fails because it is wrong anthropologically. It misunderstands the need of the human person.
When I heard you talk about that, it hits a theme I've talked about for many years, even going back to my writing on cities, that so much of the way people who live in sort of urban areas, but you don't need to single them out, it could be anybody in America. We define ourselves in part by consumption, and kind of our goal in life is to consume. I want to go to the new pour over coffee shop. I want to go to the farm to table restaurant. I want to see the concert of the new hot indie rock band. I want to wear these particular labels of clothes. And all of our consumption choices are said to define us today in a much greater way, I think, than would have been the case certainly 100 years ago, when what you did for a living, uh, would be much more central, I think, to identity. Not that work is irrelevant to people, but I think the consumer model of personal identity is much higher than it was in the past. In the past, people didn't get to consume a lot of surplus stuff.
What's fascinating about that is I think you're exactly right. I think it has led to a much more shallow existence for a lot of people. I don't think it's limited to upper class. I think in a lot of ways that dynamic is far more pronounced at even lower tiers of the socioeconomic strata, that consumptive status is viewed as aspirational. I know myself, as a son of a pastor that went to a private school because my dad taught there, and a lot of other rich kids went there. That I viewed the Nike shoes that they apparently had infinite supply of as sort of this thing to aspire to, and so there was kind of almost class envy embedded in consumption and brands and experiences, like you talk about. But then the other thing I'd say in my experience now, living in Manhattan, is consumption levels out. Like, you do get to a point where everyone has that brand, everyone has that experience, everyone goes to that restaurant. What is more unique in people, what impresses people most today, I think, is when people can, you sell a business and 3 days later you're working on your next one. There is this sort of aspirational society in the American DNA that most certainly has led to more fulfilled people, but ultimately is less shallow and less. It leaves people more satisfied. I think that the consumptive view of life is insatiable. There's no possible way to ever have enough products and experiences. Where, from a production standpoint, there is the service of your fellow man, that is again embedded in this creational truth. We are having our needs met by meeting the needs of others. Consumption is certainly not a sin. Consuming nicer things is not a sin, but trying to formulate happiness and joy and identity out of consumption is empty. And I do not believe that that is true on the productive side of this equation that I'm talking about.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of serial entrepreneurs, but one of the things that you note, and maybe being a wealth manager, you're attuned to this especially, is that all the messages that our society sends is that the aspirational ideal is not to work. The reason you're saving for retirement is so that you can stop working. As soon as you have enough money to stop working, you're out. And there's even this movement that got a lot of press a couple years ago called FIRE, Financial Independence, Retire Early. It's like, go work in your tech firm, save 70% of your money, and you can retire in your 30s or at 40 and not have to do anything the rest of your life. The idea of sort of a leisured existence as what you're trying to get to is deeply embedded into our culture, and maybe even goes back to something of the European aristocracy, which was, not a business aristocracy in some respects. I keep thinking about the Anglo-American ideal as some rich guy who inherited his money or has a title with this big estate out in the country, and he really doesn't do anything. Maybe he has servants, maybe he, occasionally meets with the prime minister or something, but this idea of like non-productive life is what you're working to achieve is the message we get bombarded with.
It definitely is. And so I try to make 2 points in the book. One is that that was only something that has happened in our society because of two blessings that made it possible. We have the luxury of having this perverted view of the human existence because life expectancy expanded first by 1 decade after baby boomers were born, before they became working age, and then by another 10 years after they became working age, before they retired. So essentially, going from an age 60 life expectancy to an age 78 life expectancy from 1946 to present day gave the mortality extension, gave it the possibility of thinking that way. Whereas previously, retirement plans were called death. And what you refer to is exactly right. I don't think it's necessarily true in the specifically American New World DNA, but in the old world, there was this sense of a kind of feudal, monarchistic, aristocratic vision where one had status by doing nothing and overseeing people who did things. The other piece is the prosperity. 3.13% real GDP growth post-war up until the time of the global financial crisis. added a tens of trillions of dollars base to the global domestic product of the economy. And at that point, we then, of course, had financial conventions, IRAs, 401ks, pensions that were kind of products and services geared towards facilitating it. But you don't really develop the mentality for this if it isn't possible, and it became possible. It is obviously theoretically possible for someone to save the money and live long enough to not have to end their life on a 25-year vacation. That fire mentality that was geared towards even younger people is, to me, just the logical conclusion of what the baby boomers did. The millennials just running with the boomer mentality. If their dad came home every night and said, I have the day circled on my calendar that I'm never going to work again once I'm eligible for the pension or whatever, and then a millennial has the ability to generate a certain amount of net worth earlier, why shouldn't they adapt the same mentality? If the message is that work is something you do so you won't have to do it anymore. As I became financially independent at a much younger age than I ever dreamed possible, it became very clear to me that there was something wrong with the way I think about this stuff relative to the rest of society, that not having that thing to wake up and do struck me as incomprehensible. And as I surrounded myself with more and more entrepreneurs and successful business people that felt the same as I did, I realized that these were mostly very well-adjusted people, very content, very happy, very purpose-driven. And yet the idea of, look, are there greater freedoms and amenities and margins available in that scenario? Of course. But the idea of saying, I now want to go golf every day, or I want to go drink every day, or I want to go be on a sailboat every day, or even the Christianized evangelical vision of this. I want to walk on the beach holding my wife's hand a lot, and then every 3 months spend a little more time volunteering with the deacons or an orphanage in Mexico, or thing that we're going to build, all of which are noble activities, all of which are good things, but in my view, none of which capture the essence of our lives.
Yeah. How do you think people should approach retirement?
Well, I first of all think we should just understand that the word needs to be used only in the context of some description of financial freedom, not a description of unproductive, inactivity. So when I think about retirement, I think about the point at which somebody doesn't need a paycheck to sustain themselves. But the notion of it meaning I don't have a paycheck, I want to be foreign for Christians. Or if I don't have a paycheck, I still have some other form of productive activity. And that, of course, is going to be different for each person. Now, some caveats are in order, because I'm well aware of the sort of risk I take here as someone who's sitting in a corner office on 6th Avenue in Manhattan and it takes a shower in the morning, not at night, and all those types of things. I don't think people work with their hands and hurt their back all day necessarily have that same luxury. And so there is going to be a difference in the way it plays out for working class people versus white collar. There's going to be a difference. I don't want people that chased bad guys on the street in their 30s to be cops on the street chasing bad guys when they're 74. There is age and stage wisdom here. I am asking at a macro level for a mentality shift that recognizes experience, expertise, and wisdom as valuable. And therefore, the burden is on companies to not adopt mandatory retirement ages. It's on senior people themselves to not be aspiring to get out of productive activity as early as possible. And of course, it's on younger people to respect older people and the wisdom that they may have. You stew all of this together, you mix all together, you get a, I think, much better recipe than we have now, where the result right now, I think we have an awful lot of very unhappy senior people. A lot of people prematurely die because they've been stripped away of purpose and activity. They're dying of boredom. And I think economically, it's very damaging. I do not believe most of our companies flourish lacking the wisdom of 66-year-olds and relying entirely on the wisdom of 26-year-olds. There has to be a better, mix of these things in a more macroeconomic sense too.
Yeah, I'm someone who has adopted a different perspective on retirement that like I'm going to plan to stay productive, basically as long as I can. That's sort of my view. On the other hand, when I look around our society, I do see the idea that people who didn't retire have essentially blocked generational turnover. So, we look at, the decrepit nature of many of the people in the U.S. Senate. We look at, the president, was born in the same year Bill Clinton was. It does seem like if you don't retire, then young people never get a chance. So how do we balance like giving younger people their opportunity to shine if the old people never go away?
What's funny, Aaron, is I got to think there's better examples of the point you're making than the political one, because I think the political one makes my point. The only reason they can do it when you're a presidential candidate or a congressman is because it isn't real work. In other words, they have an entrenched incumbency advantage, but there is not a need to actually be productive. And every now and then you do see anti-incumbency waves, and senators and Congress folks lose elections. But for the most part, especially gerrymandering, whether right or left, it's very, incumbents have a very strong advantage. And yet it's a great example in my mind of non-productivity. But I made that joke last year as I gave speech after speech about the book, and it was before Biden had dropped out of the race. But we had at the time then 77, now 78-year-old Trump, and we had then 80, now 81-year-old Biden running. And I said, apparently the only business left in America where we value senior people being in the workforce is if you're running for president. And it'd always get a laugh. But I'm not sure that we do see in technology, legal, various entrepreneurial, vocational endeavors, a lot of examples outside of the halls of Congress where 66-year-olds are standing in the way of 26-year-olds. But I really believe that where there is some of that, where there's a senior person who's there and there would be someone more upwardly mobile and capable on the way, that is so easily rectified by self-interest. Like I can't comprehend myself. I'm a 50-year-old who has 65-year-olds in my business and 25-year-olds and a ton of 35-year-olds. And I can't comprehend allowing my business to suffer because I am allowing a less productive person to be in the way of a more productive, right? So I have to sort of move the chess pieces around, make decisions around human capital in the way that's going to be most effective, and do so in a way that's honoring and dignifying to the people involved. I think that the political example is the one where people ought to be appalled, but it actually is rather ad hoc in speaking to the dysfunction of the political system, and yet I don't think there's a ton of examples of it in the private sector.
Hmm. I could have a conversation all day about that, but I want to stay focused on the book. Um, one of the other things that's kind of a dimension you bring is sort of a rejection of the idea of work-life balance. That's another one that might seem provocative because that's just one of those uh, truisms. Every company talks about our work-life balance and all that. What's your view on the work-life balance, and why don't you like that idea?
Well, I talk about it at my company when if someone says it in a first interview, I explain to them why they're not getting a second interview. Yeah, here's what I say to people that say, come on, what could you have against a work-life balance? Because my issue is obviously not that I'm against people having other things they do in their life besides work. Like I'm married and I have 3 kids and I'm involved in my church and I'm involved in a number of extracurricular activities. And so it is not that I believe that the asset allocation of our time is to be 100 in our jobs and 0 in everything else. It is that work-life balance, by actual vocabulary definition, implies that our work and our life are at odds with one another. We're trying to balance how these things fit in. And if that were true, I ask anyone who's fond of the expression work-life balance if they've ever used the term in front of their spouse, marriage-life balance. Have they ever gone home and said, honey, I can't talk right now. I'm doing marriage life balance right now. Now, the fact that we can't talk to our spouse 24 hours a day, or we might need a little breather, or we might need a little TV time or whatever, no one questions that. But the vocabulary, the
Mm.
nomenclature, I'm suggesting comes from a specifically anti workplace that we don't apply in any other domain of life. That in reality, it has been used as manipulative language to try to grant concessions to younger employees vis-a-vis their employers, to try to get young people yoga time at 3 in the afternoon or whatnot. I don't have any problem at all with people having multiple priorities, because all of us as made imago Dei are going to have multiple priorities. But what I do think it comes from is, both inside the church and in the society at large, an attempt to put a subtle downward pressure on the value of work. And again, to your earlier point, this reinforced idea that we are at our happiest selves when we're working the least. And it is, to me, rooted to false premises and has led to an incredibly false conclusion.
It seems that young people are increasingly disenchanted with work or have different priorities for work. You note that 16% of prime working age men, which I think is probably 25 to 54 typically defined, I don't know how you define it, are not in the workforce. And that's quite a high number there. And, it's interesting. My wife did some surveys and interviews as part of some community development consulting she was doing. She interviewed some employers in a town I won't mention, and some people. What she discovered was there actually are incredibly good jobs that are difficult to fill. I mean, we're talking $90,000 a year union jobs in a factory that aren't especially physically arduous. But the young people don't want those jobs. They prefer to drive Uber or DoorDash, even because they value the schedule flexibility over having that job that would have been considered the dream job, to have a $90,000 a year union job. Uh, what what do you think has happened towards the young people's thinking about work?
Well, I've spent a lot of time studying this, and that issue you brought up, it sounds like somewhat provoked by some of the data that your wife had done. I was really moved by this when I was a managing director at Morgan Stanley. I had a conversation with the CFO of Chevron, where he told a similar story about them having to go offshore to get a certain kind of bespoke welding type of deal, where they were going to pay, I think it was $70,000 to get the training, and then it went to 110,000 once they got a certain accreditation, and then they could have a career in front of them of 150, 200, and that they couldn't, and there was a significant amount they had to hire. And this was at some point, after Katrina and after financial crisis, that they wanted to do this out of the Gulf, and try to be a job boon to East Texas, Louisiana, and they couldn't get the applicants. And I thought it was a stunning fact. And there were a lot that couldn't pass a drug test. But that essentially, he said, we went offshore to get a lot of these people because they just didn't want it. And there was a lot of training, and it's a hard work and all that. But
Yeah,
again,
being on
it
an oil
sounded,
platform in the Gulf is not a easy life sometimes,
no, that's true. And this
but
wasn't
it is a
even that.
remunerative one.
It's remunerative, and they were paying for the training and preparation. And if it's not easy, that for American born, it's probably not easy for non-American born either. But I think, you know what I mean. I think it was just kind of surprising, because I could think of so many people that were struggling to kind of get a break into young adult career. Generally, young men without college degrees, and this they were not requiring any college degree for this. So it just sort of surprised me. And this was only a little bit after financial crisis. It wasn't like employees had a lot of leverage in the workforce at that time. But the data that you're referring to, in my book, all came from Nick Eberstadt in his book, Men at Work. And that 25 to 54-year-old demographic for men is, to me, the defining data point of almost everything we talk about politically, culturally, socially, economically. 3.1 million men that have left the workforce below trend line. I mean, above the trend line. So in other words, there's always a certain amount that do, but there's 3.1 million we can't explain. And the data that I use in the book, that 84% of men in that group who have a job is the same percent that had a job in the Great Depression, with the obvious massive difference being the Great Depression's 16% delta was a story of no jobs, and our current era's story is a story of men not looking for jobs. Now, we have a 4% unemployment rate right now, so there is theoretically some level of men and women that are looking for jobs and haven't found it, but 4 is extremely low. The remainder of that delta coincides with massive increases in disability claims, in unemployment, extended unemployment, the highest percentage of grown male adults living with mom and dad that we've ever had, and all other various data points that provide explanation as to how this is even possible. So I see it as a cultural malady, and I see it as one that is solvable with churches preaching the dignity of work.
Hmm. Somebody on Twitter the other day said, Boomer isn't a generation, it's a stage of life. And you and I are getting into maybe the boomer stage of life. When we're talking to especially younger people who may be in their 20s or 30s about work, how do we avoid turning into boomers and coming across poorly? I think about, you're, for example, you're a critic of remote work and work from home. And I agree with many of the critiques that you make. I work from home, but I essentially have my own business. So I'm in the office. I'm literally in my office right now, which happens to be in my house. But there is a sense in which, as we become wealthier as a society, working conditions, in a sense, should get better. Right? We have occupational safety laws. We're not chained to machines anymore, and maybe the idea that, oh, you just have to just grind horribly in the office for all these years, that was something we did. But as we become a wealthier society, uh, the bargaining power has shifted such that younger workers can simply demand, in a sense, better working conditions or more permissive, labor friendly working conditions than we had. How do you think about communicating this, I guess, is the question, in a way that younger people are going to take in? Because I think that's been a big challenge.
Communicating what specifically?
That, you should be in the office, you should be working.
Oh,
So
oh
let's
yeah,
just say you
yeah,
get your 27-year-old guy who wants to drive Uber instead of take a job in a factory,
yeah.
or he's on disability. And what is the compelling message to him that he's going to
Yeah,
take in, is not going to come across as a patronizing lecture from people like us who seem like we've got ours, and now we
yeah.
just want to, like, so see what I mean?
I very much do, and I struggle with this because there is a big part of me that thinks a sort of empathetic and persuasive, soft approach is necessary. I most certainly want to do anything possible to avoid hey, now that I've gotten here and can kick over the ladder if I want, let me tell you how to do it. I don't think a preachy approach is right. But I have also struggled with the idea. Charles Murray talks a lot about this in Coming Apart, that I'm not particularly convinced there will be change if these men don't ever feel shame. And
Hmm.
so it used to be, candidly pretty easy because the women wouldn't date the men if they didn't have jobs and activity, and if they weren't dateable if they weren't employable. And I think that was a pretty big incentive for guys, that wanted to go meet girls for obvious reasons. I'm not sure that pro-cyclicality of being marryable and employable is working in the same way. But I am sure that the negative feedback loop of it is working the same way. That less marryable men is meaning less employable, and less employable is meaning less marryable, and that's leading to both economic and social problems. So the communication of it, if I were talking to someone directly, I happen to try to take a more winsome approach to this, wouldn't be preachy. But I also think from a top down standpoint that society has coddled it too much, that it shouldn't be totally appropriate for a 30-year-old to be playing video games and smoking pot in his mom's basement, that kind of proverbial stuff. But ultimately, it's probably a bottom-up solution that comes to individual relationships, friendships, communities, communications, and yet from a policy standpoint, I'd recommend doing everything we can to not enable it. And so that's why things like UBI, and that's why things like all these extended unemployment benefits that have been done at a federal level, both of the last two macroeconomic hiccups we had, I think they help further entrench something. And one thing I will say about these folks, their resourcefulness, is I do think people learn how to be unemployed. I think that you can hone the skill of being unemployed. And there's a lot that can go into that, gaming the system and borrowing Peter to pay Paul and whatever else goes into it. But no, I believe that we are in need of something that I don't have a simple solution for, which is ultimately a very spiritual dynamic of believing work to be this creational purpose that I've talked about.
Again, my guest today is David Bahnsen. He's the author of the book Full Time Work in the Meaning of Life. Again, there is a link in the show notes to buy that. And my last question for you, David, is what made you pick the title Full Time?
Well, I first of all do love the title, and it was my wife and I were on a long walk trying to about. She's my creative inspiration on such things. I tend to be not very creative and much more analytical, and she's got a real creative skill. But there was a book called Halftime: Moving from Success to Significance, that in a lot of ways was the inspiration within the church for me writing this book.
Hmm.
I have spent over 20 years very frustrated by the evangelical message around this, and Halftime kind of encapsulates what I think has been a lot of the modern evangelical message about it, which is essentially, look, guys, it is mostly written to men. You're going to spend about half your life being successful, paying off your house, getting your kids through college, being a provider. But then the second half of your life, where you have these sort of cliche midlife crisis, that's where we get to move to significance and start really focusing on charity or on church or on some other missional activity where you can do great kingdom work. Just yesterday, my own podcast at National Review went up. It's called Capital Record, where there's a large donor advised fund called Signatory that does a lot of great work and has a lot of good people there. But they put up a thing about a person who sold their business, and now they were going to actually move their life to kingdom work, and their legacy would no longer be defined by dollars and cents in business, but would now be defined by philanthropy and a legacy of generosity. And I believe that dualism, often well intentioned, sometimes not, is deadly wrong. That it stems from a sacred secular distinction that is anti biblical. It ultimately is dripping with Gnosticism and misunderstands kingdom theology, that God's kingdom is inclusive and, in fact, centered around our earthly endeavors, that our vocational purposes are at the heart of what God made us for. And so this idea that we are to have a period of success that then moves to a period of significance is wrong on every front. I think most of what we will do that is significant are the things we do that generate the success. If I were to, at age 50, hang up my financial career so I could go build orphanages in Mexico, people are going to find out real quickly how bad I am at building orphanages in Mexico. I just believe that we have giftedness and passions and experience that matter, and to put those things aside because they transactionally did what they were supposed to, they paid off a home. I really don't believe that that's the way God speaks about any of this. So full time is trying to cast a vision for an adult life from our young adult years all the way through our senior years that doesn't center around this dualistic implication.
Well, good luck with the book. I hope it does well for you. And I know it can't be easy to find the time to write and come on podcasts when you're managing so much money, which is definitely a very high stakes business. Believe me, I would not want to be in it. David, thank you so much for joining me.
Aaron, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation.